But we have seen an interesting growing focus, as Michelle's been saying and Tracy's been saying. We've noticed that this is something that's got into, rather than the personal sphere, this is now something that's entered the public sphere that we're talking about in the public realm, and that government and the statutory sort of juggernaut is beginning to take notice of. Oh, I need help. We all need help, as Michelle was saying.
Okay, what are you going to do? When you want to move slides, just ask Madalena and she'll do it.
I'll do that. I'll go,
Madalena,
next slide. Right. Thank you very much. Take it out of my hands, always the best way. So, this is stuff you know. Who gets lonely? Anybody can get lonely, but actually we know younger people in particular get lonely, and as you know from your Ageing Better work, it's something that particularly affects older people. Bereavement, divorce, loss of a partner, long-term physical illness, disability, caring responsibilities, unemployment, poverty, mental health problems, migration, refugee status, all of these can be the underlying cause. So we know that these groups have much higher rates of loneliness, but it can also, something like this happening or one extra thing being added to this list can also be the trigger for developing loneliness from somebody who's actually been sort of mostly getting by, but can actually trigger people to maybe to withdraw themselves or just to really feel extremely something that actually they've been holding at bay. And you know the stats, and we know as well, and have known for a long time, the particular link with mental health and how lonely people experience additional stress and low self-esteem and sleep problems and lower well-being that can contribute to mental health problems, and also how mental health problems those things can contribute further to mental health problems, to loneliness. And there's a particular link from mental health problems to loneliness as well as the other way around. Because for many people with mental health problems, loneliness is their day-to-day sort of grinding experience. So mental health problems in themselves, maybe somebody experiences paranoia or social anxiety, which actually means that they will set themselves apart from other people because they don't trust other people or because they're afraid of making that first move. It might be that because of the medications that people take, and the way that might make them appear, that they're then worried about going back into family activities or social activities where they used to feel comfortable because they know now that the side effects of those medications might make people look at them strangely. We also know that those expectations that people have are well-founded, and they might know that too, because people do withdraw from people who have mental health problems. Families draw back. Tracy, good on you. You haven't. But for a lot of people, the family member who has mental health problems is the one that doesn't get invited to weddings, is the one that nobody does go to see. Sometimes because they think, oh, they won't enjoy it. Sometimes because they think, oh, there'll just be trouble. Sometimes actually because they've already been psychologically dropped from the list of people that we include. So there are a number of reasons, practical, psychological, social, why people drop out of their social networks that they may have been in, and why those social networks actually cease to reach out to people because they have mental health problems. And what we see more generally with mental health problems and loneliness, we see writ large for older people. So when we turn our attention to older people, we see the stats, and some of the other complexities that people have just ratchet up that much more. So the likelihood of losing a partner, the likelihood of having a physical health problem, the likelihood of having a disability, the likelihood of living in poverty, all these things increase, and therefore, inevitably, not just the number of people who experience loneliness, but the likelihood of that being based on a much more complex range of issues to unravel actually increases as well. I can't give you a statistical backup for this, for what this man was saying. This is a man in his 60s from a focus group that we ran in Sheffield, but this is how he felt. And this is the everyday experience of almost 2 million people across the country. 1.8 million people, older people, who feel extremely lonely. Sorry, 1.8 million. But also, mental health is a particularly compounding factor for older people for a number of different reasons. So, depression, for example, is much more prevalent in older people. But also, there's much more stigma and self-stigma attached to mental health problems for older people. So at Mind, we've been working for a long time alongside another mental health charity, Rethink Mental Illness, on the Time to Change campaign. And over the years, other people have joined in to try to combat the stigma around mental health. So we've seen the younger royals in the last couple of years join that. We've seen sports people, people from the world of entertainment, all sorts of people talking out, and we've seen a really extraordinary shift actually in attitudes amongst the general population, and particularly amongst the younger population. But actually attitudes have shifted much more slowly amongst older people. And one of the things that we know about stigma is that it isn't just how other people act towards people with mental health problems, it's how people with mental health problems understand themselves. And so if people experience mental health problems, particularly when they're older, they are less likely to be open, less likely to seek help. And so that then begins to pile on the difficulties for people. We also know that the problems are massively underestimated by services. So over and over we hear that older people, despite the higher rates of prevalence, are less represented in, for example, talking treatment services. Because why? Because people aren't referred. People aren't referred because GPs tend to think that depression is inevitable in older age, because of course you would feel sad when you're older and disabled and you've lost a partner, for example. But just because those things might trigger bereavement doesn't mean that you should continue with your sense of loss for the rest of your life, because we all experience bereavement, and GPs wouldn't expect us to experience that sense of deep loss and distress in an ongoing way. But somehow for older people, there's a sort of blinkered view. And also, we then see that services themselves are less attuned to the actual circumstances of older people that might then make sure that those services do respond to them. So you might well eventually get referred for talking treatments, but if you have to get 3 buses to get to that service, that isn't necessarily going to suit your needs if you have mobility difficulties, or the bus service isn't that great, or not accessible, or expensive. As an older person, you might need that service coming to you, or at least closer to home. So we have that sort of triple. So not only are older people more likely to have some conditions such as depression, but we have a triple sort of compounding factors following it, which is that people are less likely to come forward, services are less likely to acknowledge the seriousness of that condition, and then the services themselves are not attuned to people's needs. So we're looking at quite a complex picture, and that's just when we're talking about mental health. and loneliness. But actually, as I said, those things are often layered on top of a range of different things which are increasing as people get older often. So poor physical health and the physical life circumstances that people might be experiencing, lack of access to transport, poor housing, deprivation, inequality, crime, and often generational disadvantage. And we know that, for instance, in Middlesbrough, there are generational layer-on-layer issues of poverty that aren't just easily overcome. There may also be personal or family historical reasons, such as substance misuse, alcohol dependency, domestic abuse, experiences of childhood, that people are carrying with them, and that are not just socially complex to unravel, but actually personally complex to unravel. So we know there is no silver bullet. We need long-term holistic support where people can build back that confidence, that trust that Michelle talked about being undermined, and unpick the issues that have started to contribute to people's problems, so that we can actually take some of the pressure off the NHS. I've been very critical of what the NHS have done, but actually that's not the whole story. Some of that has landed onto the NHS, which actually should have been unravelled quite a lot earlier. So those are some of the causes, and we know what the effect of not dealing with this is for individuals. We know that the impact of loneliness and mental health problems on these complexities actually lead to increased physical health problems, leads to worsening mental health problems, cognitive decline, higher, and in fact, in the long term, obviously, higher costs on services. And that's just to illustrate really what I've been saying. So what we see is that level of complexity isn't really recognised by services, that somehow just can't quite launch themselves out of just dealing with the one thing to thinking much more about people in all their complexity, in all their humanness, in all their gloriousness, in a sense, and all the experiences that people have had, and the family and other circumstances that people have in their day-to-day life. So, where are we at with meeting this complex issue? Jo Cox set us going at a national level with some really powerful raising of the issue to in a more public sort of way, so that it left the level of just being a local or a family or a local voluntary sector set of initiatives where people were trying to do really excellent projects, but actually raising this to an issue of public debate. And, actually, you can go back. Well, it doesn't matter, you've got this one now. But the call for action that came out of that initial commission had some really great recommendations in it that you'll be very familiar with, about raising it to the level of a UK-wide strategy, thinking about measurements and indicators so that we can actually measure progress and identify this. What's measured is what's treasured, what's not measured is not noticed. Bringing this to the public attention with really easy to understand public messages, scaling up promising local interventions so that actually we can have a more national picture of excellent work that is happening locally. So all great things. And the Red Cross and the Co-op, oh yes, go on to the next one now, thank you. The Red Cross and the Co-op sort of led the way really in thinking about having an Aging Better, the Aging Better initiative and other initiatives around the country have really tried to lift what's been happening locally to something where we can see work across the country and start to measure what works and to sort of learn collectively about how to respond to what is a huge problem. And the learning from the Co-op and the Red Cross work, which was launched at the end of last year, I think is beginning again to help move us on to think, well, what as a nation should we be doing? So some very interesting learning, I think, from their community connectors work, which both goes down to the deeper level and thinks about things at a much more strategic level. So, for example, highlighting that the really specialist local services, people with deep knowledge of the vulnerable communities at a local level, there is no way around knowing absolutely what works on the ground in your area, and people who are the eyes and ears, and finding out who those people are, because some of these are the most vulnerable people. They aren't necessarily people that they may be very well known to services, but they haven't been identified as people, for whatever reason, they're on the edges of all of those services. They haven't been identified as people for whom those services should be doing something extra and additional. They identified stigma and the way that people, they won't come forward for mental health treatment. They won't come forward identifying as lonely either. We actually need to go looking for people, and that maybe a loneliness initiative is not the initiative that is going to, it might find lonely people, but lonely people won't find it. Using an asset approach for connecting people, because people don't want to come to an initiative for lonely people or an initiative for older people. My lovely old dad, who's 96, is forever being invited to old age lunch and teas. He doesn't want to go to an old age lunch and tea because in his head he's not old. He doesn't want to hang out with all those old people. If you do get him there, he loves it. But, he won't go on his own. So there's some really sort of solid, useful learning from this. Stuff that if we'd thought about it, as Michelle's slide said, it's not rocket science, but actually sometimes when we work in services, or when we're working particularly with the statutory sector that is trying to run such large services, actually these things are worth learning and learning again before we can actually absorb them and work on them and change them. We've also mined across Wales. We did a really interesting project which was funded by the Welsh Government, because they are also very interested in loneliness and how to deal with the problem of loneliness across Wales, whereas as you may not know, they have a much higher proportion of older people in their population, and obviously are quite an issue of rurality and people being very spread across areas which is quite tricky to travel across. And the work that we did had a community connector sort of element, a little bit like the Red Cross work, but we combined it with a set of workshops. This was a very short intervention, if you want to call it an intervention, that we did with people. It was just across, I think, 2 months. But over that time, there were, alongside supporting people to find existing groups that they enjoyed, so they weren't mostly older people's lunch clubs, they were book clubs or things that were genuinely linked to what people were interested in. But alongside that, there were a series of workshops which helped people to come to terms or to deal with some of the things that they had been carrying. So right head on addressing some of that underlying complexity that people were dealing with. So there were workshops on grief and loss, on dealing with anxiety, on thinking. The very first one was about helpful and unhelpful thinking. So a sort of CBT, very, very light, in an hour. Relaxation and mindfulness, all sorts of just introductions to things to help people. If that was something that was going to help them, maybe they might then go on to have more on that, but if not, just to start people to either manage or overcome or deal with, or even just become accustomed to, in some in some cases, become accustomed to and help to live with the experiences that they'd had. And it was hugely powerful. We were unsure about the brevity of these interventions, but actually just those small little tasters into thinking differently and helping people, dealing with people as complex adults with human feelings, rather than just trying to cover over those things with a lunch club. There's nothing wrong with lunch clubs, but they can that they aren't necessarily what people are needing before they can get involved in some of those things. People need an acknowledgement of what they're carrying, and feedback. The feedback, person after person, responded in this sort of way to say they'd been holding on to things for many years and being able, and this was group work, much of it, not one-to-one, actually being in a small group where people shared those sorts of feelings helped people to know that they weren't alone in carrying these sorts of things and helped people to begin to address them. And it was absolutely freeing for people and allowed them then to get involved in a way that they would have struggled to do beforehand. So again, there's a little bit of learning. It didn't do everything, but we've been running this across Wales now. We ran it as a pilot initially in 2016, and now we're running it across all of the health boards in Wales through our local mind groups. And actually, the interesting thing was, although this was a very short intervention, when we went back to people 3 months later, most of the indicators had improved rather than declined, which was quite interesting. So people, those little sort of starters, have been enough to get people going and thinking and getting engaged with other things around. So those are things that have been happening locally in response to some of the public discourse that we've seen, but locally in a more sort of connected national way. But also, eventually we have started to see some movement from government in response to the Joe Cox Commission call for a national strategy. We have now got a national strategy. And there are some commitments in that. We've got a new minister, Baroness Barron, there she is. They are looking indeed at developing consistent measures so that we can treasure what we measure and begin to identify this as something that nationally we are committed to, looking at developing the evidence base so that we can collect what works and support people to think in a more complex way about what they might be doing. Social prescribing, some particular things, these ones at the bottom here about how to help find people and reach people. Looking at the role of transport, community-led housing projects, all sorts of different things to think a little bit more widely about how we might reach people, what we might do with people, and encouragingly the role of health professionals. So all things that we've identified within the different work that we've seen, the Loneliness Commission, the Red Cross recommendations, all good things. But there is so much more that needs to be done, and that is to cream off the bits of loneliness that are just about loneliness. And actually, so much of loneliness is about so much more. And I liked what one of you was saying earlier about, I think it was Michelle, about if we deal with loneliness as a thing in itself, we will absolutely miss the main event, which is that loneliness is a result of so many more complex things. And if we just deal with the symptoms, for some people that will be enough. They have just somehow lost contact and they need a little bit of contact back in, and then they'll realise what they've been missing, and actually that will be enough for people. But for so many more people, there's so much more to do. So the strategy falls short on a number of levels, and chief, I think, among this is the role that actually national government policy has had and continues to have in contributing to some of the risk factors that contribute to loneliness. We can't ignore the role that government policy, government spending has had on perpetuating disadvantage, increasing feelings of loneliness. So our message is to stop viewing loneliness as an emotional response to individual situations and view it as a symptom of some personal historical issues for people, some health, physical and mental health issues for people, but also some wider societal issues. And then government also has a role to play as a convener for wider action, but also is a responsible agency in itself. So what is government doing to address some of those systemic inequalities? Disabled people are more likely to live in poverty. Refugees and asylum seekers who have higher levels of loneliness, higher levels of mental health problems, find it harder to access all levels of services. High proportion of people with mental health problems who are out of work. Regional deprivation, as we know here in Middlesbrough, the lack of housing, employment, educational opportunities. I could go on, but you know the list. Addressing the joining up of commissioning. So we have budgeted silos between health and social care, a massive lack of focus on what we at Mind call life support services, the support that you need, the help that you need, not to stay alive, but to live a life. So debt advice, women's refuges, drug and alcohol services, housing advice, all of those things that actually we've seen being decimated over recent years. And an improved NHS response, as well, as I've already mentioned. What next at a national level? We do need to tackle the underrepresentation of older people in mental health services, adapting services, addressing stigma, supporting people to be able to access those services without necessarily having to identify as lonely or having a mental health problem. We need much better recognition in primary care, where people struggle even to identify mental health problems in older people, let alone, I think, loneliness. Tailored talking therapies in flexible locations, social prescribing. We need funding for those long-term intensive support for people with multiple complex needs, such as drug and alcohol services or services that just help people to deal with debt, practical issues. Integration of mental and physical health support. You can't overestimate the impact that the development of a physical health condition or a disability has on your mental well-being and indeed your loneliness. Long-term funding settlement for social care for all ages, and a lot of the focus has been on older people, but actually problems for older people develop in younger people. And social care for younger people with disabilities or mental health problems is very difficult to get. And a role for the voluntary and community sector that is recognised by the statutory sector. And it's very difficult for the voluntary sector to get a look in at some of those big planning decisions that are being made. We're expected to come and sweep up and deliver with social prescribing, but actually getting in on designing what that's going to look like is very difficult. And at the local level, all of that trickles down. I'll just leave you with this slide rather than going through it, because all of what I've just said has to be replicated at the local level. Everybody, the ICS, as it's making its plans locally, it needs to be involving the voluntary sector. We need to see each GP thinking differently about how she or he interacts with patients when they come in. We need to be thinking about how local voluntary sectors are aware of what else is going on and how they can cross-refer and support each other and work together. For everything national, there's a local equivalent, and that means that every one of us, with the contacts that we have into the system or across the system, we need to do what we can to make sure that those links are really made. It's a hugely personal issue, being lonely, and people so struggle to articulate that. But we know it's there, and unless we respond in a much more proactive, much more sophisticated way, I think we will continue to have, well, perhaps as Michelle was saying, actually to simply add to the complexity and the confusion for people as they try and navigate their way around. Thanks very much.